Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Uber Freight's Supply Chain Assessments webinar. In this, we have two great presenters from our consulting team who do a lot of these projects with large, medium shippers across all modes. So look forward to sharing some information, what we see from assessments and what we think makes a successful assessment. So Ben Cubitt, I'll be moderating. I'm head of consulting at Uber Freight. I have 12 plus years with Transplace, now Uber Freight. Prior to that, was on the shipper side as manager, director, VP of transportation and procurement at folks like WestRock and Westvaco and Federal Mogul. And at Transplace, get to work with folks like Roger and Elizabeth. So Roger Seckler leads our procurement strategy, assessments, and data insights practice. Roger's a Penn State logistics grad, and he has over 10 years association with Transplace and Uber as both the customer and now has joined our consulting team. Prior to that, he worked at J&J and led global logistics strategy for Newell Brands. And for 10 plus years at Del Monte Foods, he led transportation and supply chain strategy. Elizabeth has been with us for 7 plus years. She started our managed transportation business in Greensboro, and there she worked in carrier management, engineering, data analytics, and procurement. She now leads our growing dedicated fleet and active fleet management practice, working with shippers like Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, Saputo, Mars Wrigley, and many others, helping with rationalizing fleets and in this turbulent market, right-sizing fleets and getting the most value out of fleets working with those shippers. And she's going to talk about that today. So we'll jump right in. Before we, what we're going to do is a quick market update just to kind of set the table, talk a little bit about end-to-end supply chain assessments, and then Roger is going to do a deeper dive on transportation assessments. Elizabeth's going to share what she's learned working with a lot of large shippers and dedicated carriers over multiple years on fleet assessments, which is probably our most active and growing practice area. And then Roger's also going to touch on warehouse assessments. Obviously, labor issues, space issues have been very big issues in the warehouse market over the last few years. So quick market update. I think everyone knows, you know, if you're a shipper, it's a much better market than it has been over the recent past. And when we look at it, what we see, you know, is this dramatic drop in spot rates, which per history gets followed 6 months later by contract rates. So Transplace does over 300 procurement events per year. I think Roger's in the middle of helping shippers with 2 or 3 different LTL and truckload bids right now, his team, and kicking off a few more. And of course, we're seeing just very strong results. You know, if you're a shipper, this is a really favorable market. If you're a carrier, it's a very tough market. So, you know, how do you decide what you want to focus on? Where are areas for improvement? You know, if every day is not spent just trying to find a truck and cover a load, what we're seeing is projects like assessments, inbound freight projects, LTL, areas that may not have got as much attention the last few years when it was just all hands on deck to cover loads and keep product flowing and deal with all the changes of the market. So when we look at this, you know, besides our network where we can really see the impact of all these bids and the 15 billion in freight that we see on a daily basis, you know, I look a lot at FTR's active truck utilization. That's that chart in the bottom right. And when you look at that, we've gone from 98, 90% truck utilization, which means if you have a truck and you have a driver, how utilized is it? Every truck had a home every day. Actually, you know, that steady drop, which has matched kind of rates dropping over the past 18 months, you see that not only are we back to a more traditional 94, 95%, but we actually have dropped below the 10-year average. So active truck utilization has gone from kind of a historical high to kind of below the average trend line to 88%. So carriers are really struggling to, you know, to keep trucks active. I was talking with a carrier who said they had lost a few drivers because, you know, they just go to another carrier and hope maybe they can get more miles. And so we're seeing, you know, some of that turnover increase and some other changes. So what will change? We think this market is going to stay much the same. over the balance of this year. And it really won't change until we see one of two things: either volume picking up again after some downward trends the past 6 months. Does the Fed stick the soft landing, or rates get so bad we see carriers going out of business and drivers leaving, and that creates a capacity issue. So that's kind of the market that we're looking at. Just to give you a little background, the Uber Freight network, we see over 14 billion in freight, 530 million transactions. We see another 3 billion of parcels. So when we talk about the assessments, that's what we're basing that on. That's where our data insights, best practices, our data benchmarking comes from, is all of that plus another 4 or 5 billion that we see through our consulting practice with people who are not on our TM platform but are Uber Freight partners. So with that background, I think I will pass it over to Roger, and he's going to dig a little deeper into full network assessments. I do have one more slide, sorry. When we think about assessments, we occasionally do broad end-to-end assessments, and we really enjoy those. They're challenging, very insightful projects, but going all the way from supplier management to customer delivery. But what we see a lot is that folks dive into parts of the supply chain. So it could be a transportation assessment. It could be transportation and warehousing. People may want to look at fleet. They may want to do just a dedicated or should I have a private fleet? Or if I have a private fleet, how does it operate? So we're going to dive into these three sub areas, but know that, there's also great value in a full end-to-end assessment, and certainly things we partner with folks on. So Roger, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Ben. So before I want to talk a minute when we say assessment, right? What is an assessment? And for us, an assessment is an opportunity for us to come in and work with a shipper to understand how things work, what their performance is, compare that to some peers, and then identify some optimization opportunities. We do that through a pretty structured approach. So we've developed an assessment methodology that applies whether it's a transportation, a fleet, a warehouse, a business planning, other areas. It's a proven methodology that helps us apply some structure to how we approach assessments, but it's adaptable to fit a shipper's unique circumstances. And from a structure perspective, we generally start with things like baseline and performance. So help you understand, what do you do today? How does that work? What are your current metrics? Then we'll look at some quantifying things like savings opportunities. So here's where you have some transactional optimization. Here's where you have some rate or procurement opportunity. And then to achieve that, we identify operational improvements that you might make. So process-wise, systems-wise, things you can change. So the methodology, it's structured, but it's designed to be adaptable. And it really brings to bear many of our assessment tools that we have. So we have a lot of great data on benchmarking and market access and KPIs. As Ben mentioned, we deal with a lot of shippers of all sizes. And so we have a pretty solid foundation of just how different shippers operate, how different transportation networks operate. We can bring that view into an organization. And then we have really robust engineering and optimization tools, whether it be shipment planning, load execution, load optimization, strategic network design. We can bring these tools in to our assessments to really help quantify opportunities. And a real focus for us is around actionable output. So when we come in and we do an assessment, whether it's fleet, warehouse, or otherwise, our goal is to give the shipper something tangible that they can take away. We don't want to leave you just with a presentation and a couple bullet points and slides. We focus on, these are things you can do right now to generate savings. And we provide a roadmap to realizing the value. So here are things that we may show as phase one based on what we know of your network, based on what we've learned through optimization exercises. These are things that a shipper might go after right away. There's a phase two, which generally involves things that maybe require a little bit more change or maybe some systems enhancements, but they're still within a normal 3, 6, maybe 12-month period of time. And then we also provide an outlook on, if you were to really change your business processes or your approach to transportation and logistics to drive incremental value, these are things that would be on a longer-term roadmap, but they might require more things like technology investment, team structure, things like that. So when we do an assessment, it's partly about telling you where we think you are today and showing you where you are today. But we really also try to show, here's where you could be going and here's how you can get there. So it's designed to be an actionable relevant exercise to help shippers really make changes in their performance.
And Roger, I think what we're saying is, this is our approach, and if a shipper is doing an assessment, these are the things they need to be thinking about, and the ways that they should approach an assessment.
Right. We'll work with you on the project plans, the task list. We do a lot of this interactive with your teams, but these are the things as you think about what do you want to get out of an assessment. These are the things we'd come and you should expect out of us. So why do an assessment? What's driving it? Why are these becoming a more and more important tool for shippers to use as they look to continuously manage cost and performance within their networks? Your team turnover continues to be a challenge for shippers of all sizes. So we have a lot of folks that are new to the industry, or they're new to a shipper. They may not know what life could have been like over the last 3 years. They just know what they jumped into. So we see a lot of value in bringing an outside perspective in and helping teams understand, where maybe there are some bad habits that they learned because that's what the person before them did, or other ways to kind of tweak, team management, team training, personnel, things like that. Technology is still a major factor in every shipper, both how do you leverage what you have today and where do you have some gaps and some investments you might want to consider. And then a big area for this recently has been, a focus on flexibility and resiliency. So, over the last 3 years, we've all learned how quickly and dramatically things can change. And a lot of folks have adapted, and we've put in some stopgap measures to get by. We've figured out how to live in a challenging world. But an assessment is an opportunity to bring an outside lens into your operations and identify areas of rigidity within your processes and technology that might prevent you from being able to react more quickly to changes in the marketplace. So things like procurement cycles, team structure, technology integration, things that on an everyday basis may not appear to be an issue, but they limit your ability to react and be flexible. We can bring to light some of those challenges that we see and provide some recommended actions to take to improve the flexibility within your supply chain. And at the end of the day, a lot of it right now is coming down to, things are going better than they were, but are they really running well? Are we doing as well as we could, given the investments we've made in people and technology and structures? So a lot of what we focus on with these is, you are better than you were a year ago, but if you do these 5 or 6 things, you could really be good and you'd be set for the next several years. Our assessments generally have 2 main components to it. There's a qualitative side and a quantitative side. On the qualitative side, it's where we're focused a lot on people, process, technology. What is my team structure? What do they do? What processes do we have in place to support them or that they have to manage within on their day-to-day jobs? And what's the technology landscape we have in place today that our teams are using to try to maximize value? Within that, we spend a lot of time on an operations and process focus. And we do that through data collection by talking with your teams. So we'll talk through shippers, order management, transportation planning, procurement, warehouse ops. We try to understand a lot of the processes and things that are happening today to try to get to the why behind the action, right? So we do this, why do we do it? These are the constraints we put in place. And so we build a catalog of processes and insights based on what the teams are doing today. We can compare that against similar shippers that we see out in the marketplace that we interact with. At the same time, we bring a quantitative approach to this, which is really data-driven. I mentioned earlier some of our modeling tools and analytic capabilities. This is where we'll look at a shipper's transactions, their shipping history. We'll really dive into transaction-level optimization opportunities like shipment planning, consolidation. We do a lot of benchmarking to show where you may be buying above market, and there might be an opportunity to do a procurement event. And the focus on this is really what we call them our RUM levers: rate, utilization, miles, and mode. Am I buying efficiently to market? Do I have a consistent process by which I assess my market competitiveness? Am I utilizing my equipment in terms of weight, cube, hundredweight, things like that? Miles is all around optimal sourcing and minimizing out-of-region shipping. And then mode is about leveraging that LTL to truckload to intermodal, and make sure you're maximizing that. And through an assessment, because we do these concurrently, we were able to take things we learned in the qualitative, the people process technology view, and we start to understand how that demonstrates itself in the data you provide us. So we see the data, it might show a shipment history of X, and it looks a little odd. Because we're talking through the teams that generate that activity and are constrained by the tools in place to do it, we start understanding why things look the way they do in the data. And that really helps us make sure that our optimization opportunities are relevant to you. They're not standard pie in the sky, you should be doing this. They are informed by things we know happen within your network today. And that's how we're able to phase in some of the opportunities, because we understand you have a challenge that you can't get over quickly. But if you change this thing, maybe you can. And so the idea is to bring these two together at the end. So you see the quantitative savings, but they're informed by what we know of your business processes and technology and some recommendations on how to change them. This is a view that we bring to that in terms of savings. We do a lot of quantitative analysis. We tend to put them into common activity areas that we would see. So things like LTL shipment planning, rate benchmarking, pooling, things like that. We show, there's an optimal savings if everything went perfect, but we really try to help shippers understand that you're unlikely to get all of that, at least on day one. So here's a little bit of a risk-adjusted model to help you understand what you can really expect to get within a reasonable amount of time. And then we do phasing, as I mentioned earlier. So because we've now worked with you to understand how you operate your business today, we have a pretty good feel generally on these are things within that operation you could go after quickly. These would be phase 2 things that are still feasible, but they might have a larger change management component to them. And then these are things that are more longer term, continuous improvement value adds. They're really good opportunities. They're relevant to you, but you might have to make some structural changes or process systems changes or investments to really get to them. So our goal is, as I mentioned earlier, is about action. We want to give you something that says, coming out of this assessment, you'll not only have our view of where you fit on a maturity model or where we think you have opportunities for improvement, but pretty tangible actions that we think are relevant and reasonable to go after based on your current network.
And Roger, are these, when you see these, is it effective to just use industry ranges, or is there actually engineering behind this?
Yeah, there's usually, there's a lot of engineering behind it, and it's largely based on two things. One is how a shipper may internally risk adjust projects. So they may have a savings number, but when they go through an IRR analysis or something like that, they have a risk adjustment. But we'll also base it on what we've learned from the shipper that says, based on how you operate your TMS today, we think you can get this. We see other shippers with a similar constraint only be able to achieve a certain portion of this volume. So we will bring some outside perspective, but we try to make it focused on how you operate today. If you change it, it will open up a broader pool of savings.
Great, thanks. And is there a focus on, how does quick wins play into this? When you talk about cost savings, is there wait to the end of the project and get a list, or how does that work?
Yeah, and typically there's a little bit of an iterative process for the quick wins that are just really obvious. So we might see, generally, they might be a practice that was put in place to address one particular issue that happened 2 years ago, but it's stayed in place and become just part of how you do the business. We're able to identify some of those things early on and say, there's no need to wait, 4 more weeks for us to do a final report out. Starting next week, you might want to modify this setting or start changing this decision criteria to drive real value. It won't take away from any of the longer term phase 2 and phase 3 things, but as we identify really obvious, implementable quick wins, we'll start to work on that as we go through the process. So this is a view of just some samples of the assessment. The first thing I'd call out is, they are generally available in color. So we do try to do some work around highlighting things visually so you can call out, where things look red, yellow, green. We do a lot of that sort of stop lighting. But we focus on your baselining. Here's what we see you're doing today. We do a lot of benchmarking, both on rate, but also on key operating metrics. So we see a lot of shippers. We run a lot of freight. We can help you put some perspective into your performance there. The maturity model is really where we bring together the qualitative piece that says, based on your teams, the processes they leverage, and the technologies you have, here's where we would put you on a scale of 1 to 5 based on similar shipper peers and what we see them doing that's really effective to drive value. And then we get into a lot of quantitative output. Again, the quantitative analysis is driven by optimization, but we modify it and we phase it based on how you operate and what access you have to tools and capabilities today and what the roadmap might look like moving forward. And we generally then move this into more of a strategic discussion around team structure, in-source, outsource decisions, and we've developed a pretty comprehensive sort of pyramid approach to all the things that are required to execute a supply chain efficiently. What are things that you as a shipper should own and do because they're strategic? What are things at the bottom of the pyramid that are really transactional and not part of your core competency that you should find an expert partner to partner with? And then what's the stuff in the middle that you find the partner of best fit? You might want to develop some of that, or it might suggest some areas where you go to an outside partner. But the output of this is there's a lot of informative and benchmarking, and there's a lot of actionable, if you do this, we'd expect you to get this value. Just one simple case study that we did recently, not simple, but an example. We had a large CPG company. They spent a little over $400 million in freight. They noticed their service and costs were not performing where they needed it to be, and it appeared to be more negative than overall market conditions would have indicated. And so they asked us to come in and try to help them understand things that they are doing within their own network that might be causing some of these challenges. So again, we took a look at their people. Do they have the teams working on the right things? Do they have the right processes to support the business and the challenges it's facing? Do they have the right technology to support that? What we ended up coming up with is 10 target areas for improvement, again, with a bias towards action. 3 or 4 of them were pretty quick wins. If you go do this right now, it might be a sourced-in event. It might be modifications, in this case, to a dedicated fleet arrangement. And then there were some longer-term things around mode optimization, transit time modifications, LTL pooling, things like that. So we're able to come in and take a look at what a shipper's doing, from $10 million, $5 million in freight spend up to over $1 billion. We've worked with shippers across that spectrum, and that really helps us bring in some really good industry insights and reasonable insights into each shipper. And so I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk a little bit about how we apply that same methodology to some of the fleet assessments that we work with.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, and as we alluded to in a couple of the other slides, shippers are doing these assessments when they see freight market changes and changes within their own network, maybe a shift in demand, maybe some company-wide restructuring that has affected the dedicated fleet or your private fleet, right? That could be affecting them in the area of performance or high cost or both. So with the uncertainty of the future, we have seen that shippers are considering reducing some of their fleet size here and there where it makes sense, where the fleets aren't utilized to their max, or where empty mileage is really high, driving up cost. So when we take a look at a shipper's network and we assess their dedicated fleet, we start with the procurement practices. That even goes into how their contract is set up with the dedicated carrier. We take a look at their invoices and how that compares back to their contract. Is that carrier actually invoicing them according to the agreement? Then we take a look at those cost out opportunities, right? Continuous moves, third-party backhauls. Do we have the right lane fits on the fleet? Can we slip seat? So bottom line, shippers want to know, how can we model a fleet to meet our business needs while also meeting our cost needs? So on this slide, I want to show you a little bit more detail on how we cover an assessment, how our shippers are taking a look at their assessment of their fleet. So initially, you have to have a baseline. You have to have a good understanding of the data. You have to baseline the performance of your fleet. So what does their utilization look like today? How many empty miles do they have today? What's their fleet count? What is their area of service? And what is their on-time delivery performance, and how does that look? So once we have collected that kind of baseline of current state fleet, we're able to compare to other fleets that are managing similar locations, right? So we can understand, based off industry standards, how does this utilization compare to my expectations? Based off of what we put in place for this fleet and how we modeled it to begin with, how far have we varied away from that? We also benchmark against over the road, so we can understand over the road costs. So we can understand, is this fleet a premium to my cost if I were to just move it over the road instead, non-dedicated? And then also benchmarking against other fleet costs to see, perhaps my provider's rates are a little bit outdated and we need to take a look at that. So we talked about auditing invoices and taking a look at contracts. We want to make sure that the contracts have safeguards for both the carrier and the shipper to be set up for success with their budget planning. No surprises there. Taking a look at the processes, the people, the tools you're using on a regular basis to optimize your fleet. How can those be leaned and improved, and running that gap analysis. So finally, the most exciting part of it is the fleet analysis, understanding, do I have the right fleet size? Perhaps my fleet could be a lot smaller and we could get a lot more utilization out of the drivers on the fleet. The drivers are happier, they're making more money, and my cost per load is less as a result. We also take a look at lane fit. So perhaps there are some lanes in the network that have some unusual windows of delivery or high dwell that's really driving the utilization down for your fleet. And if that lane's not necessary for the fleet to run to hit a specific service goal, it may make a lot more sense, and you could have a lot of savings opportunity by removing that lane and perhaps replacing it with another lane that makes sense for the fleet.
Hey, Elizabeth,
Also
let me ask you,
sure.
a question. So when I think of fleets, I think of kind of different type fleets. There's local fleets, there's more regional fleets, there's kind of continuous move fleets. Is it one set of KPIs? Is utilization, for instance, is there one number that's kind of best in class, or does that vary by fleet or fleet size?
It sure does. So speaking of utilization, we think about fleets, we try to separate it into a longer haul fleet versus a shorter haul fleet. When I'm thinking about a shorter haul, my largest KPI, most important KPI is turns per truck, right? I want to know how many turns I can move in a day, and then how many does that result to in a week, and how can I utilize those drivers' hours and flip loads the most. And then on the longer haul fleets, utilization is also important. We're measuring it by miles, but we also are very focused on empty miles. Because we have that longer length of haul, we want to aim to implement continuous moves and third-party backhauls in some cases in order to close that empty miles gap and reduce cost.
And, a lot of fleet contracts are 2 or 3 years. So, do you establish a KPI at the time of sourcing and run with that for 3 years, or, how do you look at that?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that here soon, because our KPIs should be set when we model the fleet. And that KPI should be integrated with your budget goals, right? So there's status quo KPI of like, hey, we've got to hit this to meet our budget. And then we know that there's also opportunity to continuously improve. And perhaps our stretch goal is, 10% improvement from that, right?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you got it. So, lastly, as far as what we're taking a look at with the fleet, we may assess heavy haul opportunities, implementing lightweight equipment. We take a look where we can expand. Perhaps this provider is really providing a lot of value, and we really could expand that elsewhere. So once we've sized up the opportunity, we want to implement this in a project management format, creating project charters and making sure that everyone's held accountable to execute that workflow. And then active fleet management is going to be key to sustaining the results, right? Once everyone can have a great foundation for a fleet at the beginning, and then due to network changes, due to not having visibility on what's going on in your network, that performance could go from 100, to less than that really fast. So keeping an eye with KPI, a dashboard preferably on how your fleet health is doing. So here I'm going to go over a small case study. This is a short haul fleet running out of the Midwest that, as you can see in the top chart, if you look at the columns, this is the turns per week per truck. This fleet was clearly under my industry standard. So industry standard is at least 2 loads per day. When you're thinking about a length of haul, less than 50 miles, you should easily be able to get 2 turns in a day, depending on the circumstances, right? So initially when we saw this, we wanted to run an optimization to see if there was opportunity to improve turns for this fleet. So the first thing we did was the baseline, taking the volume and entering it into our fleet modeling tool to understand, okay, should we adjust the fleet size of this lane, or should we change lanes on this fleet? So the result of the analysis showed that we could actually reduce some of the longer length of haul lanes that this fleet was moving and increase volume on shorter length of hauls in order to optimize those drivers, get more loads every day. And since this customer was and carrier's agreement was based off of a fixed cost model, then the increased amount of turns just allowed for a very low cost per load. And you can see that after we put this into place, there's a direct correlation between cost per load dropping and our turns almost doubling. So over the year time, this was 11% savings to the fleet spend by just reducing the fleet from three trucks to one.
And Elizabeth, I think this is interesting. This when we think about a fleet, this is kind of an example, and I think the way you like to measure it, you know, some of our shippers do well over 200,000 shipments a year with a fleet, but we don't look at that as one fleet. And when we're doing assessments or active fleet management, we look at it as kind of 20 different fleets based on, you know, there could be one in Southern California, there could be one in Pennsylvania. Is that accurate?
Yes, exactly. Because every part of the country, you're going to be paying a different W-2 for that driver. You're going to have different circumstances, and you're operating different customer networks. So you're absolutely going to have to treat those separately.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure. So this is, you know, a lot of graphs that are hard to understand, but we just wanted to illustrate an example of how our shippers are managing their dedicated fleets, active management, weekly calls with carriers, sometimes if it's necessary, but at least once a month, going over all the key performance indicators.
Hey, Elizabeth,
Visibility goes.
Elizabeth, I hate to interrupt you. I just want to, for our administrators, I've seen a few comments where people say they can't see the slide. So I don't know if that's an individual problem, but just a quality check to make sure that everyone can see the slides. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So the slide I'm showing, if you can't see it, is a view of a dedicated fleet dashboard. So on a dedicated fleet dashboard, I've talked a lot about utilization. So this is going to help you understand how many turns, how many miles each and every driver on average is moving on a weekly basis. So you want to understand that, and you want to look at it over time to understand shifts. Perhaps seasonality affects your utilization, so you can make business choices appropriately. We also watch our empty miles percent on these dashboards. We also, for a longer haul fleet, are very focused on backhaul revenue. When the shipper doesn't have a lot of continuous moves internally, we do rely on third-party backhaul programs that we offer here at Uber to help support that backhaul revenue and reduce costs for the shipper, as well as reduce empty miles and emissions being emitted. Okay. So I hope that gave you guys some clarity on, you know, what shippers are looking at through assessments of their dedicated fleet. We wanted to mention that at least one time a year, our shippers are taking a look at their fleets. That's what we would recommend. But sometimes more is necessary, depending on, like I mentioned earlier, shifts in your network. Perhaps you're going up on a contract closure with your carrier, and you want to assess, hey, before I go and sign another 3-year agreement, is this the right area for me to have dedicated fleet for our business? Lots of opportunities to optimize fleet network. We see 6 to 10% of fleet spend savings when we run these optimization activities to determine right lane fit and right fleet size for fleets. And then I mentioned carrier backhaul revenue. Holding the carriers accountable to that is key. You do want to lean and partner with your carrier to make sure there's a backhaul revenue guarantee in place. If there's not already continuous moves within the network that are going to reduce those empty miles. Industry standard for a fleet with average length of haul one way over 200 miles, I would say 15 to 20% empty miles is goal. And then we talked about visibility, so I wanted to leave you with that. Of course, you can have a great plan, not sustain it, lose sight of what's happening as your network changes, as your carrier performs differently, and then be back at square one. So having that active fleet management in place is going to be key to continuous improvement and to manage the changes in your network.
Yeah, and I have one more question, Elizabeth, and I want to make a public service announcement. I think folks that may be having trouble seeing slides, they are presented. It's probably a slide view. You have to make sure you're in slide view and that your whole screen's not just Roger and Elizabeth's picture, but make sure it's really a view on your screen. If you look bottom center, bottom right, other areas, you should be able to go to a slide view and see the slides. Elizabeth, one final question before we turn it back over to Roger, talk a little bit about warehouse assessments. We talk about assessments, then active fleet management. Do you think you can start an active fleet management without an assessment? And is it always a full assessment, or what's your view on that?
I think it depends on the state of the shipper's network. So I would always prefer an assessment before jumping into active fleet management. If you don't have the option and you need to go ahead and have active fleet manage immediately, there's always the opportunity to work with the carrier simultaneously and put in some efforts through your assessment along the way.
Great. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think we're going to pass it back to Roger to talk about warehouse assessments.
Sure, great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Elizabeth. So similar to transportation and on the fleet assessments, current things and trends that we see are driving a real need and a real value driver for warehouse assessments are, as we talked about at the kickoff of the call, shippers continue to right size inventory and rationalize space commitments. We saw folks over the past couple of years who popped up a lot of satellite warehouses or outside storage facilities to either accommodate customer demand or inventory fluctuations. Now that things are in many ways starting to somewhat stabilize for shippers, it's a good opportunity to revisit some of those decisions. Do I need all of them? Are they in the right locations? And am I operating them efficiently? Especially if it was a rapid startup, now's a great time to go back in and remember and identify shortcuts that you may have taken to get something up and running, but they're not how you want to run it long term. So that's, as people right size inventory and space, this is a great time. Automation and efficiency are key, especially while labor is getting somewhat better in the warehouse market. I think it's still not where a lot of folks would like to see it. And so one answer to labor challenges is to make sure you're using the labor you have as efficiently as possible, and automation is one key part of that. And then the flexibility and resiliency again. Do we have the ability to flex up and flex down as the business changes? And continuous improvement is another big focus, particularly within warehouse operations. Do I have a lean culture or continuous improvement mindset that will make this just a part of how we operate and how we continuously drive cost out of the network? An assessment can be sort of the prompt to put in place more long-term, consistent, sustainable processes and procedures and automation that help make these savings consistent and sustainable over time. From a warehouse perspective, we have a structured methodology that's adaptable to each instance, but it kicks off with a couple key steps. First, really aligning with the shipper on what the strategy is. We do the same baseline and benchmarking of current state that we do with the other assessments. We do some analysis on things like pick rates, efficiency, engineered labor standards, things like that. And then we develop a roadmap that really helps shippers understand, again, based on what we've learned with how you operate and why you operate the way you do, what are some near-term things you can put in place, and then what might be some longer drivers or longer investments that would really make a sustainable improvement in your operations. The bottom right is some of the common questions we're trying to answer as part of this. Do I have the right metrics? Do I have any metrics? How do I measure my teams and make sure they're performing well? What type of technology or equipment could I use to improve this operation? Technology and material handling equipment are key when we look at an inside the four walls design and optimization. So there's a lot of solutions out there. It's about helping find the right one that fits your business. how can I flow product differently throughout the warehouse? How can I in-gate and out-gate product and product flows more consistently? How do I free up space? So how do I increase storage density? Do I have an opportunity for different types of racking? And then bigger questions like, how much space do I need? Do I have the right facilities? Are they in the right location? This can turn into a network design model or strategic network design. And often we see these two play hand in hand. A warehouse assessment can be driven by a strategic network model that says I need to modify my warehouses. Or we could be doing a warehouse assessment and understand maybe these just aren't the right fit for you geographically. There's another strategic network modeling view that might help you understand some bigger picture changes to make. So again, a proven methodology, it's flexible and adaptable, but it really helps understand and show what you're doing today and where we think there are implementable solutions for a shipper to achieve value in the near term. This is a case study, just a sample of some of the things we do. In this case, this was an automotive manufacturer. They had a 50,000 square foot warehouse. We worked in 15,000 square foot facilities to 900,000 and above facilities. So size, again, just like transportation network spend, we deal with a lot of shippers across the market space. In this case, they had a warehouse that just wasn't able to accommodate growth. And when we dug into it, we got inside the building and we looked at things like, there were some functions like kit building that weren't really part of the core warehouse capability, but it was something that was put in place years ago. And they thought since it was where the product is, it was the cheapest way. And we were able to look at some things that said, maybe not. Back to what should you be doing yourself? What should you be doing in your locations? And what you might want a partner to do. We're able to look at the whole operation within the facility and identify ways to streamline the process and the optimization. In terms of outcome, we were able to achieve some pretty noticeable savings for this shipper. Overall, 34% cost reduction. 20% of that came out of material handling in terms of both the types of equipment needed, the leases, what that structure looked like, and then how the teams use the equipment to really get the most out of it. Didn't necessarily involve new or radical automation changes, but it was more about maximizing what they have, right-sizing what they had, and making sure they're using it in the right way. We also looked at different picking strategies. Again, a lot of folks don't understand when they think of Uber Freight, we're great transportation experts. We do a lot of work inside warehouses looking at pick modules. Are you all floor pick? Do you do cherry picks? Do you need a conveyor system? What's the right solution for the type of product and the volume? I mentioned earlier that the kitting process was taking up a lot of space in this warehouse, space that could be more productively used for a more efficient storage and a more efficient picking system. And again, overall, a significant reduction in cost. And we do a lot of the work, and we have partners that do some of the engineering work, so we can actually come in and redesign a rack system, redesign product flows, and shipping office processes and tools. We can do a lot within the four walls, and we can do a lot within the network in terms of right size, right location, in-source versus outsource, right contract structure, things like that. So in this case, this is one where we went inside the building, we spent some time with them and really found ways to optimize their inventory management and their product flow. And then for others, we've looked at where those buildings should be and do design build, 3PL outsource, a lot of areas within your warehouse that we're able to use an assessment to identify, again, key opportunities and then roadmap them in terms of phases of what you can do now and what might be a longer term investment.
Hey, Roger, I've got a question. So much like the discussion with Elizabeth, a fleet is not a fleet. There's regional fleets, there's local fleets, there's, CPG shippers, there's, manufacturers, there's distributors. So there's all kinds of things that go into a design. We were having a meeting with the shipper we'd done a couple different warehouse projects with, and they asked an interesting question. They said, I go to ProMat, I go to other industry shows, and I see a lot of really high-tech technology. It seems like, 90% of what I see is ASRS, robotics, but I don't see that in my design, or, no one ever recommends that to me, be it us or be it other warehouse consulting. So what do you, how do you react to that? I thought it was an interesting question. We had a pretty interesting discussion about it, but why do you think there can be that disconnect between what you may see at industry shows versus what really fits a warehouse?
Yeah, I think as a shipper, you really need to be careful about a really nice looking solution that's looking for a problem or designed to fit it, right? And so every warehouse is unique, every type of solution is unique, and there are some just by their nature, there are some more automated solutions that are most efficiently and effectively deployed in a new build environment where you're designing a building to accommodate a certain type of equipment. There's others that are much more conducive to moving into an existing facility. They don't involve as many rack changes or aisle widths and things like that. So I think it's understanding that there are a lot of pretty cool automated systems out there. There's laser guided vehicles, ASRS, automated pick racks. There's a lot of that looks great, but when you get down to the time, cost, and effort to implement, particularly in a legacy environment, sometimes the speed to value for those can be hard. There's others where, if you're building a new DC, this is probably the right time to look at some of those new solutions because you can build them from the ground up and really take advantage of it. And so part of our assessment is, we never like to say this building's outlived its usefulness, it's time to sunset. If there are some scenarios where you just say we have maximized what you do in this facility, in order to go to the next step, there might need to be a longer term approach that might involve a new site. It might involve new material handling equipment within that site. But we generally find, just by looking at the processes in place, the storage solutions, and putting some hard analytics around facility flows, we can really tweak and maximize existing sites pretty effectively, which makes it harder then to justify a radical change to your material handling equipment and automation.
Well, great. Well, Roger, that was very helpful. We want to get to some Q&A, but we did, we have a robust consulting practice. We were looking at some statistics the other day. We did 128 projects last year around 84 different customers. A lot of those are repeat projects with the same customer, but a lot of new projects. But looking at that, we wanted to share, what are we seeing? So, what are folks focused on in 2023 now that, you're not just spending every waking moment trying to find a truck? What we've seen is that assessments, broad or focused assessments are something as people try to say, how do I get my network efficiency back? Of course, with what's going on, a lot of focus on bids and procurement. We've actually seen, a lot of folks are doing truckload bids because it's such a good market, but we've also seen people who maybe haven't paid as much attention to LTL or parcel, focusing on those. Then a lot of inbound freight. You've got control of your outbound network, it's better. Have you gained control of your inbound? As we mentioned, a lot more focus on LTL. A lot of folks, there's been a lot of churn, more churn than we've ever seen during these robust dynamic market conditions. So there's a lot of onboarding, integrating new team members, and then turning the lens internally to warehouse optimization. I want to make my warehouse labor still difficult. It's difficult to find good labor. It's difficult to keep them. Some markets are worse than others. So I need to really maximize my labor efficiency. Optimizing networks. The last few years, we've seen the number of network optimization projects we see go up fivefold. And, folks are looking at their networks more often, both to changing market conditions or mergers or acquisitions. And the network's grown up as kind of a bunch of different networks, and it's time to try to leverage that. And then sustainability for CPGs, retailers, and other industries. There's a real focus on sustainability, reducing carbon footprint, getting more efficient in the network, and being able to calculate those greenhouse reductions and be able to share that with your employees, with your customers, via social media, et cetera. So we see that as a real focus again. I wanted to jump to a couple questions. The first one was, what are examples of technology that shippers are investing in? And so when we do assessments, I think of a very broad assessment we did for a very large CPG, one who ranks very high in the Gartner rankings of best supply chain. So it's great to partner with them. We learned a lot. And what we looked at with them was not just, what technology do they have? Do they have the right technology? Or are they fully using that technology? And then, they were a large shipper and they had a lot of different technology they had invested in. So how was all that technology working together, and were they maximizing the value, and had they built integrations for automation and efficiency? But some of the areas we see shippers investing in, certainly visibility. There's a real desire to be able to tell a customer service person, sales, supply chain planning, where is the status of both, the focus on outbound, but equally on inbound. Take that darkness that can be inbound shipments. You don't know where it is till it arrives at the dock, but be able to track and get better visibility. TMS, TMS has seen significant growth, so TMS implementations remain an area of investment. Data analytics and collaboration, so things like LaneHub, that was why we were very interested in acquiring LaneHub, but there's tools out there that let shippers, across their own network or across multiple customers do partial load consolidation, be able to collaborate on lane moves or regional moves. And then there's other spot software. If you have a fleet, how are you routing that fleet and how are you measuring productivity? Roger, Elizabeth, any I left out? What else do you see shippers investing in from a technology perspective?
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of the visibility and data analytics. And there's other things when we think visibility, things like yard management or tools to aggregate some of the shipment tracking data that you're able to get from carrier partners, things like that. And then really, before you invest in new technology, we find it really helpful to make sure you're making the most of what you've got, which is sort of, I think, Ben, the shipper you were referring to, have done a few of those where they were looking to upgrade their system or implement a new TMS. And when we looked at it, they had the capabilities, they just hadn't really implemented it properly. So there's some of that plays into technology investment. Can mean a new system. It can also mean just making the most of what you've got.
So next question, that was an interesting one, and I'll do a little bit of a spin on it. But what do we see with the remerging of head haul and backhaul networks now that we're coming out of COVID? And that really was a challenge for the industry. And if you look at some modes like intermodal and rail, they're just kind of getting that synchronization back well established, and ocean has been that way a little bit. You turn China on and off. Imagine what that does to the ocean, but also the rail network, because once those containers hit a West Coast port, they often then become part of the intermodal network. So, we've worked with some shippers. Elizabeth's done a lot of dedicated work with a shipper, and if you think about their two big markets are the grocery industry and the food service industry. So when the food service industry, all the fast casual and events, you think about sporting events, musical events, there's a lot of food and beverage consumed at those. But when all those shut down, all that demand moved to the grocery industry, right? And so a lot more trucks to ship some of that product than going to food service. And so, we've seen a lot of disruption. I think when we look at why capacity is better, I think that's a factor. And, when you think about, carriers were having to go longer length of haul because, they had matched this shipper's inbound with this shipper's outbound to put two shipments together and drive trucks into a head haul market or back haul market. And, when that gets disrupted, that creates inefficiency across the network. So part of the reason why we have more capacity, I think, is because we've had some of that leveling out and networks coming back in. I think, Elizabeth, for fleets, that's a big issue. So as we saw, different parts of the network, turn on, turn off, patterns change, customers' production issues, that was really one of the factors driving a need for active fleet management.
Yes, absolutely. And the benefit of some of our shippers working with our Uber Freight backhaul programs is that rather than having a committed backhaul for the dedicated fleet, we'll put them on an ad hoc backhaul program so that if this week they need this load coming out of Atlanta, bringing them to Chicago, they can have it, but they're not committed to it. So it's really just almost a transactional option for that dedicated fleet to use those backhauls to fill empty mileage gap, but not be committed to the lane, which is really helpful when we have these network changes that we don't know what's the expected flow, in a few months from now.
Someone asked, what about industries like fruit and vegetables? Are there, do assessments work? What are the different, peculiarities? And I think it is very different. I think the tool set and someone that has a broad view of the market, we did an assessment in the fracking industry. We went up to the Dakotas when fracking was just booming up there and did an assessment, and it was completely different. You look at things like hot shots and what you'll pay to get an electric motor out to an oil rig or to an oil well. Those of us that have watched every penny and, low shipment cost. It can astound what you see in some of these. So Roger, I know you and your team have dealt with assessments across a lot of industries. So does the process fit different industries, and how do you adapt it?
Yeah, I think every industry, every shipper is a little different, but in the end, a lot of them have the same challenges, and some of the key processes, and again, the methodology we apply applies to fruit and vegetable, it applies to hazmat, it applies to pharmaceuticals. It's still addressing common focus areas, but really understanding why you may be a little different than a peer or an industry benchmark, and understanding what that is, but then also understanding that doesn't necessarily mean that some other opportunities and solutions won't apply to you just because it's different. So I think any industry, any market, as you mentioned, Ben, we've dealt with a wide variety of types of businesses, and I think we've been successfully able to come in and drive value through the assessment process for each one of them.
Yeah, and I think whether you partner with us or you do it yourself, and hopefully that's what we're conveying, why we may say us sometimes, because it's just hard to. What we're trying to convey is just overall assessment, whether you partner with us or someone else, what are the things that drive it? And as a follow-up question that someone else asked, have we dealt with the chip shortage, the automotive industry, the impact on tier 2, tier 3 suppliers? We have. We've done some assessments in that market, and it really, one of the first things you have to look at is getting a good baseline, because, if we look at a time period, and sometimes because that some of those markets like that are cross-border. Someone asked about nearshoring. When you look at Mexico, when Mexico's really shut down for a long time for COVID, even much more than maybe the U.S. was, and so you still had the northbound product, but you didn't have the southbound flows. All those things really come into it. And what we found when we work in some of these industries that were really disrupted, you have to put more due diligence in the baseline, because you really have to, like, if you're looking at a long data set, you really look at that data set and you're like, wow, what happened to this plant? Because there's a lot of shipments, and there's no shipments, then there's shipments, or they may appear somewhere else, and this plant couldn't get product, so we were shipping from this plant. So I think both the COVID timeline, or some of these industries like the automotive industry with the chip shortage that had plants closed down for extended periods of time, and they had different, they maybe had a source from a different, and we saw that with some people, very basic home building manufacturing, where it wasn't a matter of producing where you optimally wanted to produce, you were producing wherever you could get raw materials and labor. And so I think the trick in that is, how do you adjust your baseline? How do you adjust your KPIs? And then how do you make sure you don't build those biases in? And what we've seen out of all that is, the need to build flexibility in and be able to understand scenarios. I think, let me see if we have time for one more question. A lot of great questions. We'll try to answer some of these separately. I think there's a little bit of question, Elizabeth, about fleets, and with reshoring or with different requirements, you have fleets that require a 4-to-1 trailer ratio. And so how does that, things like that, where you may need, we've certainly seen that where people are willing to invest in excess equipment for service, or they're willing to invest in more trailers because, they want to have more live loads, and they want to maybe give more flexibility at either end. How does that fit into assessment? You're trying to drive to an optimal KPI, but you've got, kind of some outliers versus the industry standard.
Absolutely. In CPG industries, we tend to see, closer to a 3-to-1 ratio, but that can vary. So in like a paper packaging situation, we see a lot more than that, for example. So that is part of what we take a look at when we're looking at the full network and understanding the assessment. It depends on, customers could be taking up that trailer space unwarranted. So sometimes protocols have to be put in place to make sure that customers or sites are not loading the loads out of order, right? And so that could be using more trailers than necessary. Maybe we're using trailers for storage, and that's a high cost. So that all needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Well, I think all very good, all very helpful. This has been a great discussion. I always enjoy being on these panels and hearing some of the back and forth. If there are any other questions, please reach out to us. People have asked, what model assessments does Transplace have? We have a lot of different models. Rapid assessment, we've done 16-week assessments. We've done 3-week assessments. We've done them where the customer's restrained on resources, so we do more of the heavy lifting, or the customer really, this is a critical project for them and they have quite a few folks on their side. So we think these projects are best when they're done collaboratively. We think if you're going to do an assessment, the broader footprint, the more people you bring in, planning, sales, finance, technology. If you're going to really marshal the resources to do a 5, 6, 12-week assessment, the broader view you can take, inbound, outbound, multiple business units, I think gives you a better result. That's not always the case. We do it single business units. We do rapid assessments, but there's a lot of different models, working with us, working with someone else, or doing it internally. If you'd like more information following this webinar, you can reach any of us on the panel, and Elizabeth, Roger, I, or anyone else at Uber Freight, and they'll get it over to us. So hopefully this was helpful, and please reach out to us if you'd like more information, and we can also share some of the deck. So thanks a lot, everyone, and appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks.